So this month, we're going to have our developer community call. So we're covering the app security, Azure AD application security. So we're going to talk about secure automation. So a scenario where we have DevOps and applications. So we'll get into a bit more details in some minutes. First things first. So we're recording the call, so other people can join us and watch that later. You see the link for the recordings at the end of the session. So there will be a link there and a bunch of links that you see around many times. So this call is designed for developers who wants to implement or interested in implementing Microsoft Identity Platform solutions. We will address topics that you submit using the community discussion and via the form that we have, the feedback form that you submit when you join us. This is not a support channel, so we're going to use Stack Overflow to ask your questions and get support from. We have our team that monitors that Stack Overflow for this subject. One thing that is new this month, not this month, I think we now have 1 or 2 months already. We started the Identity Developer blog, so you can see the link on the screen. So we started last month, so we're trying to post it like every week. One thing that you should know is that there is a blog post related to the session that is about to be posted in this blog. If it's not coming out today, it will come tomorrow or worst case on Monday. But we expect that to be released today. And the links for social media, so where you can see the announcements for the upcoming calls and see what's coming up on next month and how things are going. So this is just a reminder. So that's the recording for our community call. So if you don't have the link for the community call in your calendar, so you should have the invite, otherwise you wouldn't be able to join. We do have a bunch of places where you can get that. There's a short link on screen. You should have on the invitation for today. In the Identity Developer blog that I just pasted in a chat, there is a page for events where you can find all the events for all identity developer related events that we have up and going. We had a Microsoft Graphs call this week, or a workshop this week. We have an ADFS migration workshop next week. There is an identity developer workshop coming on beginning of May. So a bunch of things you can check the page to be updated. So let's get started. Let's get into the session itself, where we're going to talk about service principles and automation. Let's give it a little bit of introduction so we can set the stage when we start. We can start moving around and seeing how we can do this. So the scenario we're going to cover in this. So basically what we're going to address today are services or Daemon applications. So applications that run on the background or run on schedule, or usually, in summary, they don't have a user logged in, right? So they run in the background, or say. So this type of applications, they are common. You commonly use it in DevOps scenarios and all kinds of automation tasks, integration, systems integration, security interactions between applications, batch processing, data integration, resource provisioning, managing resources at scale in cloud applications, deploy infrastructure as a code, monitor system performance. So a lot of different things that happen, but these things don't really have a user connected to it. So it's a task that runs, process data, and then run an action, do something, and that's how it works. Because of that, so the key factor or key information is that we don't have user context on this scenario. So we don't know, actually, there is no user running anything. And that is the main difference of what we're calling app-only versus delegated access. Right. On an app-only scenario, we will have the information in the tokens about the application and the rows or the details about the application itself. We don't have anything related to the user. On a delegated access, the application token has not only application information, but mostly user information. So who the user is, which eventually which groups they're part of, what roles the user is member of, what is the application that is connecting, what is the target audience for the application. That's the main thing here, because that's where the difference starts and where the challenges become more noticed. Another important concept, just to set the stage, so there probably a lot of you already know about that, but just to set stage, in Azure AD, there are two types of application objects. One is the application itself that represents the web API or the web application that wants to access resources, or is the resource that will be accessed, right? So, but this is majorly a template. There's no security information related to the application. You will find the application registration in the Microsoft Entra Admin Center under app registrations, and that's where this object resides. The service principal is bound to the application object. So it represents the identity of the application. So that's the security part of it. It's used to authenticate and authorize the application to access other resources. It actually controls access to resources, because that's where the identity of the app gets together, delegated with the user permission, and ensure that only authorized applications have access to these service principals. The name is a bit misleading, but in the Entra Admin portal, Admin Center, we will have it under Enterprise Applications. So what you see under Enterprise Applications are actually the service principals. If you're using Graph or PowerShell or any other management, you won't see Enterprise Applications, you see Service Principal, and you see an application. And that's what we're going to do with the demos. Right? We're going to do a lot of demos to understand how these things work and what is the impact. What about app-only permissions? So app-only permissions are the way that the application tries to get information about who is accessing or what the application can do, a resource application, let's say this way, right? This information may be in the token already, like the most common thing that you probably heard of is what we call app rows. So we know the ID of the application that is calling. We know what rows this application is member of to access a specific resource. I'm using key vault because it's a quite common scenario, and that will illustrate what we're going to talk about and when we start to think about least privilege and scoping permissions later today. In key vault, you have the option to get an access token from Azure AD to Azure Key Vault. Right. So that service, you can request Azure AD an access token for this service, and you send the access token to that service. But that service has a separate database where it does check the permissions that your service principal has, your application has. So it will look into an external system. I'm representing that as a database, but that could be something, it's an internal thing that Kivo does, but could be your application checking a database or a configuration file to check if that application is authorized to do something. In case of Key Vault, this is done by what they call Key Vault policies, access policies, and then you say this service principal can access this key or can read this key, can write this key. So you do that per key and per application. So if you have multiple applications, you can just go there and set the values, set the permissions one by one. That means that that application can only read a few keys that are stored on Key Vault or certificates that are stored in Key Vault, but not everything. So it doesn't have any management access, any control or anything around many management permission around Key Vault, but it can just read a specific key that it needs or you requires to run. All right. So that is a very important concept because the permission may come in the token, but may also be somewhere else. Right, so where Key Vault will fetch that data and will double check, and that can be done with your own applications when you write your own application. That is also actually done by Graph in a different way, and that's what we're going to talk about a little bit later. Well, if the Key Vault scenario get clear, so let's talk a bit about how do we get app-only access tokens, and that's where we're going to move to the demo. So the PowerShell script is there just for your reference. So I'll actually do it live, and let's see how this goes. So let me share my screen first. So this is the key vote screen. So just for reference, we were talking about that a minute ago. So that's how you set an access policy, and then you just take a service principal and give access to a key. And we just need an access token to do that. Let's do that then. So let's do some configuration here. We will start with an application, fresh. So we're going to create an application. So hopefully you already did that before. So community call. Right, so single tenant app. I don't need to set anything, right? It's just register, right? So we do have some interesting information here. I will actually show you something. I'll talk about the permissions first. So you see that we do have by default user.read permission, but because our scenario is about application only permissions, that doesn't matter, right? So we don't have any application permissions assigned to this application, and that's what we want. So what we're going to do now is actually create a secret for our application. So new client secret, because this is doesn't have a user context, so it does require a secret. So we can do certificates, but I don't mind this is being shared and recorded, because at the end of the day, I will actually delete this. So it's no big deal. Let me copy and paste this somewhere so I don't lose it. Okay, so we should be good. So that's what we need. Let's go to PowerShell now. So we're using MSAL PS, because just to request access tokens in an easier way, and so you can see the access token is a PowerShell implementation of the MSAL library. We're going to use the client credential scenario. So that's my tenant ID. The client secret, the client ID. So I hope this is not new from any one of you. So this is something you already know. So this is nothing special so far. Then I need to take the client ID from the app I just created. And I need the client secret that I just copied. Oh, my copy and paste is not working well today. All right, that famous secret. And an important thing. So one very important scenario here, one topic here, is that we need to set a scope for MSAL. So in MSAL or in Azure AD, every time you request a token, you need to tell what is the scope. And for application-only permissions, the scope is always .default, right? So .default actually tells Azure AD to issue an application token. So that's what's happening behind the scenes. So give a token for that application. It doesn't matter what permissions are set. If you have permissions, they will come with. If you don't have permissions, because that's our scenario, you won't have anything. Another important thing is that the first part of the request tells what is the resource you're trying to connect. In this case, we're requesting graph. So in the key vote example, you would use the key vote endpoint or the key vote identifier. So you would get a token for key vote. In our case, we're going to request a token for graph with the standard set of permissions that you remember is known, right? We don't have any permissions. Nothing was given to us. All right, that should be good. We'll just request now an access token. And if I didn't make anything wrong, it does seem all right, we will be able to see the access token. And there you go. Right, so stop here. No permissions were set. And I just requested an access token for Azure AD. And that's the key thing from what we're going to do from now on, right? So there's no permissions specific for that application. My application just requested a token for graph, and I was given a token for graph. Let's just look at this token quickly so you have an idea of what we're talking about. And if I do it right. I have a coordination problem today with copy and paste. There you go. Right. So I requested a token for graph, and that's what I got. So the audience for that access token is graph. If you play around here, you see the app ID and the display name are actually my client ones. There are some other things here, but to be honest, it doesn't really matter for us. This token is actually meant to be consumed by graph. No other application that receives this token should do anything with that because they are not meant to it. So it doesn't matter. That's graph problem, what it's going to do with that token. So graph will decide when it receives a token, the access token in our request, we'll look into it and say what this access token can do, right? One thing that is interesting to know is that there is this special claim that we have that is in a regular app. This is an optional claim, and in graph that is it's by default. There's a claim called ID type that will tell you this is an app token, right? This is not a delegated access. That's some interesting stuff that you can find around here. But let's go back to the presentation then, and then we'll see what we can do with this.
It looks like there are a couple of questions in the chat.
Oh, right.
Zebra, is the PowerShell script available?
It will be in a blog, but I can share. So there's nothing special. It's the only one from the screenshots. So it's but I can share. That's not a problem.
Ismail Carlo, what is the best practice for keeping metadata associated with app registrations? For example, things would normally store as tags under owner, support, contact info, etc. Yeah, Carlo, if you want to come off mute, you might want to just.
Yeah, please.
Yeah, just wondering. So with app registrations, you don't really have the option to store tags, but you have the need from a support point of view to manage who is the owner, where do we go for support, like because inevitably you'll end up with hundreds, if not thousands, of app registrations. Just wondering if there's any best practice advice you have for that.
So are we talking about client access the same way we're talking about, like scheduled tasks, Daemon services, or is it a different scenario like IoT? Because IoT is a common problem.
No,
I'm
talking about really any application that we register in Azure AD for authentication purposes.
All right, so I'll take that question then in a different perspective. So
Sure.
In OAuth, OpenID Connect, so you need to create an application for everything, right? So the best practice is to split everything. So if you have an API, you need to create an app registration for that API. If you have something that calls that API that needs to be a separate app, for instance, if it is a web application that runs in the browser, JavaScript application, you will need a registration. If it is a native app, another registration. If it is a mobile app, another registration. So it's usually the concept is that obviously you can shortcut this and just create one single app for everything, just like SAML does. That doesn't have this concept. But that's not a good practice because you won't be able to control which application can do different things. Right? Because when you create multiple applications, you can control not only the user, but also what the application can do. So imagine that you have an application that is a management tool that that runs on Windows, and you want that application to have full access to the whole management API. But then you have a web version of it that runs on mobile phones that you want to restrict. So they use the same API, but you don't want them to access the same functionality. So you can restrict that in different ways. So if you just shortcut this and create keep reusing applications, so you won't have this functionality. The more shared, the more problem you may have.
Yeah, no, I understand that. I'm sorry, I might have misled you with my question. What I'm asking is more about the metadata that we would normally have. So for pretty much any object in Azure, we would store tags to help us know who does this object belong to. And the problem I see with app registrations is that they exist, but you really don't have any way to refer back to who owns it, who supports it, right? So I'm just wondering if there's any practices that we should put in place for that.
Gotcha. So for that specific point, so there is the ownership concept that we're going to talk about later is related to security. So the owner today for applications is more about who can manage that app. But you do have tags with application registrations, although they're not in the UI. You can change that. You can add tags to the application, and that's possible. There is something called security attributes now that we introduced that you can consume and can mix that with conditional access. And I'm pretty sure that the UI doesn't show it, but there is a description attribute inside the application too. I'm almost sure
that's
about
great.
that.
Yeah, I'll check that out.
Yeah, some attributes are not exposed in the UI, but you can use them. The tags, for instance. If you open the manifest, you see the tags there, and then you can include your own tags. You know the manifest tab? I can actually do that. Give me a second. Do you see the tags here?
Yep.
So you can add tags here. It's an array of strings, so you can just put in a value that you want to, and that will be persisted in the service principal too.
Perfect. Thank you.
Welcome. All right. So one of the resources that we usually consume is this automation applications with services and daemons, and these tasks are actually Azure AD objects that are behind Microsoft Graph. So Microsoft Graph is an API that gives you access to a lot of different Microsoft features or products like Microsoft 365, Windows, or Enterprise Mobility Security. So it actually gives you a unified programmability model that you can get to access to anything Microsoft 365 without needing to learn how SharePoint does this or how Exchange does that. So it's unique. It's a single endpoint for everything. And in that direction, it means that the endpoint or the whole Graph API is sliced in different permissions. Right? And that's how we control that access. So we use what we call Microsoft Graph API permissions. Right? So graph permissions, they are split in three pieces. So the first one is the resource, what you're trying to access. So a user, a group, a mail setting, a drive, a file, a SharePoint site. There's a bunch of things that you can access. Then what type of operation that you want to do. Usually they are read or read-write. There's one exception in the screen that I'll talk about in a minute. And then you have constraints, right? So constraints are actually saying what you can do inside these operations for that specific object. For app permissions, they are usually all, meaning that you usually will have access to everything. So if you have a permission that is user.readwrite.all, will give you your application the permission to do anything into any user in your tenant, right? So that is the biggest problem that we have with Microsoft Graph permissions, that is too permissive. So if you're talking about users, we can't control what you can do and which users you can modify. So that application will be able to do that for everything. Same for mailboxes and everything else. So we started to introduce different things to make it more granular. One thing that you will see is the .create permission. .create is not available to every object. Usually the objects that have ownership, the concept of an owner. Groups, I don't remember off the top of my head, but I think it's only for groups. And applications that also have owners, though they use the owned by. So there's a difference between that, but the idea is the same. So with something .create, so you'll be able to, that application will be able to create objects without assigning it in user, right? And owned by, the application will be able to manage only the objects that it owns. So if a service principal owns a group, the application will be able to manage that group. If it manages an application on a service principal, it will be able to manage that service principal. Recently, we introduced something called .selected. So .selected is actually part of SharePoint Online. So within SharePoint, when you do sites.selected, you go to SharePoint and you say, well, this service principal can access these sites. So instead of accessing all SharePoint sites, you can control which SharePoint sites these users can access. Talk about it in the end. So when we talk specifically about SharePoint and Exchange Online, but just for you to know about that. Another thing about Exchange Online is that Exchange is special, and they don't have the constraint. The permissions in Exchange don't have the constraint part, but you need to know that they are all by default. So when you have mail.read, it means mail.read.all for application permission. So you can that service principal, that application will be able to read all mailboxes available in Exchange. So without any restrictions. Same for calendar, same for what else you can get in SharePoint, tasks or in Exchange. So tasks, anything that is available in Exchange you'll be able to do that unrestricted. Again, we'll cover that later. How we can change that. So, but before we talk about Exchange and SharePoint, we're going to cover one thing that is quite important, and it's usually forgotten. So Active Directory, Azure Active Directory also has scoping. So the first scoping that you just saw is the scoping for the application using application permissions. They're also known as app roles. So if you're developing your own application, you will create app roles. So they are the same as application permissions in Graph. And they will be this user.read. And actually, let's do that in a portal. So we look into that. So I showed you that my application doesn't have any permissions, right? But I could have added permissions to it. So take Microsoft Graph. We're not talking about delegated permission. Our focus today is automation and DevOps. So we're looking into application permissions. I talked about mail. So there you go. So you see? So the newest permissions, these are a newer permission that does have all, but the vast majority in Exchange doesn't have all, but they are all, right? So any user, you see any user, all mailboxes. So that is actually very, very open. So when you give a permission like that, same for user. So if I take a user, you see that user will be user.read.all, user.readWrite.all, meaning that there's no restriction. So whatever I give that permission will actually be used for any objects in the directory. But, well, let's step back, and then before we understand what I'm going to show right now. So you remember that my token doesn't have any permission, right? So we created a token like this. So we have an access token for Graph, but doesn't have any permission. To make it more interesting, I will remove this permission. I'll leave it blank. I can even request a new access token, but it won't change anything. But just to make it clear that we don't need any permissions, but we do have an access token. So let's play around with this access token now. So let me show you something. Let's go back. Let's go back to our PowerShell. So now that I have an access token, I'm going to use the Graph SDK to connect to Graph. It was the same token that you saw before. So we're connected with that token. But then I will try something, right? You know that this application doesn't have any permission. It's connected to Graph, but let's see if it works. Okay. MG user. Right, so let's do it again. So tenant ID. I'm really sorry, I need to do that again. Let's make it quick. Okay, scope. I don't believe that was pretty bad.
You can do a scope of current user, right? And then you wouldn't need administrator, right?
Yeah, good. Here's a scope, right? Scope.
Yeah, scope and then current user.
Thank you. Click. Hey, I'm trying. Oh, that's weird. Okay, that will be horrible. Right, so what I'll do, I will go back to the design, to the presentation, and I'll try to fix that in a minute. But what I wanted to show is that when you do connect graph, get MG user will fail, but not with the error that we saw. We would receive an access denied, right? Because we can't use that. But we do have access to some objects with that token. So there is a permission that is default, that is the permission for the object itself. So because that service principal has an application and the service principal, it can connect to itself and read the information. So if I run get MG application, even with that token without any permission, I will be able to see the details for that application and the related service principal. The catch is you can't browse because we don't have browse permissions. So you need to know the object ID. Right, so the idea is that we get this object ID, and then we can query that object with that specific token. So that should work straight away. It will be horrible if I can't show you that. Let me do one thing. See if it works. We'll give it some time to install. I just don't want to change it right now, otherwise you see that it's different. So the first demo, the idea is that I would show you that this would work, right? Even without any graph permissions, because so the object can read itself. But if I try anything else in graph, because we don't have permissions, it will fail. So that is the initial scenario with that token. So one of the solution that's more common is the one that you just go back to the graph permission, and then you add the permission that you want. So I want to add users. So I come here, I add a permission, a graph permission for application. I want to read users. I just do user.read all or read write all. Do admin consent, and that would work. The problem with that permission is that it's unrestricted. So we're going to be able to do anything with all the users and without all the attributes. That's not what I want. So that we want to reduce the permissions. So be more specific on what this can be done, what can be done, and what objects we want to change. So we're not going to do that. So we're not adding any permissions here, but we're going to use another resource. We're going to use the user administrator directory role. Remember when I talked about the idea of having key vault that will check its own policies to see if that service principal has access to the key. So here is the same thing. So Azure AD controls access to objects using roles. So you have a role gives access to users. So let's look into a role. So Azure AD roles, they stay around here. So roles and admins, roles. And these are all the Azure AD roles that are available. So for instance, if I want to manage users, I can come here and say user, administrator, right? I can check what the permissions that are assigned to this role, and you can do that with all the rows that are around there, and you can see everything that role can do, right? And actually, you will see that there's a bit more stuff here. If you look into groups, you see that there are some group permissions around here too, you see? So the user administrator actually has some rights with groups and a bunch of things. And then you say, okay, but this is not what I want. It's probably even more than users.read write all. What you can actually do is if you go back to roles and administrator, you can create a custom role. And by creating a custom role, you will be able to tell which permissions you want to give. So all the Azure AD directory permissions are here. Only directory, right? So we talked about Exchange briefly in SharePoint. We'll talk about that in the next slide. But these are only available for the directory permissions. So you see user licenses. So they're pretty specific. So you can do a lot of very, very specific information about the user. And you can just delegate that. And I'm talking about users and groups, but you can see devices, you can see applications, you can see service principals, anything. So if you want to further filter or scope the permissions, you can use a custom permission, a custom role. But if you want to do just like user manager or applications, we were talking about applications, so application manager or application administrator, application developer. So all these roles, they can be done with the service principal. Well, let's take the user one, user administrator, and let's see how it looks like. So under assignments, we're going to add an assignment, and that is the key thing. So instead of selecting a user, what we're going to do is actually select a service principal. And I think I called it community call. There you go. You see, this is the application that I just created. It's available. I just assign it. Let me see. Before I assign it, let's see if I can get the test to work again. No. Damn it. So you need to believe me that this will work. So now, this is like a permanent thing. So you cannot use PIM to elevate the access because it doesn't have a user, so there's no elevation. So it's always permanent. Right? So you do the assignment. And that's it. So now I need to request the token again. So when I request the token again, that information will be actually in the token. So I think that at least should work. Let's do get the token again. Again, remember that this token is for graph, right? It doesn't really matter what we're going to do with that. So we shouldn't even be looking at it. But you see, there's no much difference in here. Usually what may happen is that we will see the groups that we add into this width column. Right, so these are directory rows that we have access to. So if you start increasing, it may be that you didn't refresh yet. I may even can call it again. Oh, I know what. Force to refresh. So because MSAL uses the cache, so you probably shouldn't request it again. There you go. There you go. Now I have a new width. You see? But this is only relevant for Azure AD. So Graph will receive that. We'll check into Azure AD if that role actually has whatever the user is trying to do, and we'll give it access or not. Right? So that access will actually be controlled by something completely different from what we did before. So instead of giving full control to users, full control to groups, full control to applications, mailboxes, or whatever we have there, what we're going to use is directory rows to restrict that access. So, and can use the custom rows to be very, very specific. So if you want the user, for instance, a common scenario that I've seen before with customers, they didn't want a principal to be able to delete objects. So what you do, you create a custom row that will only allow them to create things, but never delete. Right, and then you will be able to do that and play around with these things. So you can control that, change it here and there. There's one more thing here. When we follow that path, when we go that route, the rows route, there is another thing that is available that we can also use. So when you go to rows and admins, we're not only talking about rows itself, but where is that? Okay, here. So we do have administrative units, right? Well, what does that mean? So that means that we can even scope not only what users, what permissions the application can do within the users, but we can also scope what users that application can modify or can update, right? Because what we can do here is actually in an administrative unit, we can perform an assignment, right? So when you go to roles, you see user administrator here. And when we add the assignment, obviously because I added before, it won't work. It may work, but it won't make sense, right? So I can add the service principal for user administrator under the user administrator role, but that will be specific to that administrative unit. I'll try to do that. Maybe it will work. It did. Cool. So when we go back to the administrative unit, you see that these are the only users that that application can manage. Same for groups, for devices, and in the future, you also soon you'll be able to do that for other objects as we are working on more objects that will be available within an admin unit. Right? Does it make sense? Right. So instead of giving access to everything to an application, that is a common complaint that we have. That graph permissions are too permissive. We don't want to do graph permissions to everyone. I don't want that application to modify everything. So would that address your scenario? So do you have that kind of concern? So instead of being more specific in the types of permissions that we want to give. I just want to highlight, this is actually available for a while. It's just like, it's documented, but it's lost in the middle of the Microsoft documents and it's not that clear, but this just works, right? Actually, there is a bonus. You saw that I was able to get an access token for Graph, right? And I could get access tokens for any applications that you create. So if I create an API, so I go to the enterprise application, and I do have an API here. So that's more a bonus. Right. So if you take an API, it doesn't matter. Any application in the tenant can request an access token for this API. It's the API problem to define if the token has access to the API or not. Right. But we can use in Active Directory, in Azure Active Directory, we can control that. We can restrict. The reason you can get a token is because every app registration by default has assignment required set to no. That's the reason you can get a token for the application, even if you don't have any specific permission set to it. If you change that to yes, it will be mandatory to have your service principal included here. All right? Otherwise, you won't be able to access the application or get a token for that application. So that's how you restrict the access. I think, if I'm not mistaken, this only works with Graph. Yeah, you can't do service principals using the UI, but that is available. Make sense? So let me stop around here and see if there are questions in the chat. Or if you want to come unmute too. Okay, so I'm rolling backwards. So there's a question about how do we scope the API permission to a target security group only? There are two aspects. Do you want to manage one single group, or do you want to manage the members of the security group? If you want to come unmute, it will be cool. I think it was Sundara, right? I got your name right. Oh, okay. So that will be with administrative units. So you will do user administrators. So don't do user read all. You should not do, because if the permissions, they are combined. So if you do user.read.all, that will actually give everything. There's a remark I need to give you in a minute. But the idea is that you go to an admin unit and you do user administrator. You want to manage all the users. So you want to manage the members of the group. Is that it? Because there are two ways of doing this. So if you want to manage the users, you can't do that with groups. So you create an admin unit and you put your users here, and then you can manage only the users around here. If you want to manage only that group, you put the group here, and then you do group administrator. Actually, user administrator will also work. But you need the administrative unit. You can't do that with groups as you do in Active Directory, that you just delegate the permission to a group. You can't do that. You need to create an admin unit and do that, and do the change.
Hey, Michael, this is Sundar. Can you hear me now?
Yes, all good.
Oh, thank you. Thank you for the clarification. So the rationale behind this question is, if the users request permissions, for example, user.read write all, right? So are we able to scope that permission to a specific targeted security group only instead of keeping it global across the tenant? So that was the background behind my question.
Did I answer your question?
Yes, I think your answer is about through the administrative unit.
Administrative unit, yeah. Gotcha. And we have dynamic membership too. So if you have like, you can use attributes as the question that happened before, that came before. Oh, you can use a tag or something. I don't think you can filter a tag, I'm sorry. But you can play around with some attributes so you can create dynamic membership. The user, that service principal can manage users in specific region. So you can create rules here.
Gotcha. Okay. Thank you.
Welcome. So, by the way, you mentioned you read write all. That's a good thing. The problem with read is that we can't block read in the tenant, right? So every object is readable for anything. So if you give read permission in the tenant, you will always read all the users, right? So that is a limitation, let's say, gotcha. of the rights. But read write we can control. Again, just make it very, very clear. So you can't do, if you do give read write, it will be read write. So you should not give. It should be the same that we were doing here. So the app registration needs to be blank, right? No permissions assigned. Not forget about that. So just show it so you can make it clear. Our community call down. So see, so this is still blank, always blank. So if you want to use admin units, you don't put anything in here. You can combine, but the problem is that the most permissive will work. So if you just give read write all here, it will be read write all. So you should not give anything here, so you can control that via roles and admin units.
Got it. Thank you.
Welcome. So any questions that I lost there, besides the hints on the PowerShell that I won't be able to fix as quick as here?
I had a question on the authentication options for service principals, especially in backend applications. So normally one of the answers is client ID, client secret. Another answer would be certificate authentication. Are there other options?
Yes, there are 4 different ways of getting access tokens. So in the UI, I use it as secret, right? So straightforward. Certificates, as you mentioned, but we do have federated credentials. So you can use tokens from other identity providers and exchange that token by an Azure AD token. So I think the most common scenario is GitHub. So if you get a token from GitHub, GitHub comes to Azure AD, send the GitHub token, and we exchange that by an Azure AD access token. So without any credentials. So Azure AD, you configure Azure AD to trust the token from GitHub.
Federated identity, basically.
Yeah. So okay. So customer manager keys, GitHub actions, Kubernetes, and other is any OpenID connection.
Okay, that's option number 3, and you said 4?
Yeah, 4 is not in the UI. So 4 is manage identities. So if you have a resource that is running on Azure, like an Azure function, an Azure VM, anything, I think even Power Apps can do that. So there is the concept of managed identities, and a managed identity has a trust relationship within the platform, meaning that every managed identity create a service principal in Azure AD. It doesn't show in the UI. So you won't see it here, but you can do the same things that we were talking about here. But you may only need to use PowerShell to do that, because most of the time you won't be able to do that through the UI. But that's the safest you can do, because there's no password involved, no credentials. But the only thing is that you need to have the resource running on Azure.
Okay, and the service principal, basically it's, let's say, an account.
It is.
If ever,
So the managed
ever-
identity
yeah,
doesn't show
go
it
ahead.
up here. You don't have an app registration and it doesn't show in the UI. So that is a common scenario, for instance, with Key Vault. So in Key Vault, you use the managed identity to set the permission to the key. But although you won't see in the UI, you can do that via PowerShell to do the assignments as you would.
So username and password are not is not an option for authenticating a service principal.
Oh no, because username and password is actually, you would need to fall into MFA and all these other things that may fail. And
Yeah,
in these
plus
cases,
it requires interactive login.
exactly. So
Yeah.
that's why we recommend to use client credentials for service principals.
Okay, thank you.
You're welcome. I think just realized we are on time. So quickly, so the part about Exchange Online and SharePoint. So Exchange Online and SharePoint, they have different approaches. So Exchange Online actually is very misleading because you do the access permissions, the mail read and everything, as you would have access to everything in Exchange, but the Exchange administrator needs to go on the Exchange side and Exchange Online and create a policy to restrict what that service principal can access. So you need to work together with the Exchange administrator to scope down the access to the mailboxes. SharePoint is different. SharePoint works with the selected concept we're talking about. So you give the permission. You don't give the all permission, but you give selected. Then you go on SharePoint and then you say, oh, this service principal can access these sites. So files is under preview. It will come soon. So before we close then, so just remember, permissions are cumulative. So whatever you give, you get. So if you mix them, it's always the most permissive. So if you do group administrator role plus user read write all, you would have both of them. So they will work together, they will combine. So the resource app is responsible to validate the token, so check what it can be done. Azure AD roles will scope object type and permissions, so what permissions to what objects, and administrative units will scope within the same object types. So which users you will have permission to do, which groups, which devices you would need to manage, right? So we'll move to the last slide because then we have all the information about the call. So there is the survey link here in the slide. There is the link for where we're going to publish the call or the content. So you will see the video under. Let me put that in the chat. All right. So first link for the feedback. Second link is when the recording will be available. So it will be in the Microsoft 365 community PNP. The next application developer events on the events page. On the next call will be on May 18. We don't have a topic yet, so feel free to submit it. Keep an eye on the identity blogs because then I will post the scripts there probably today or tomorrow. So you can get the PowerShell and make sure that you make it work, unlike me. And don't update anything when you're going to do the demo. All right, so I'm still around. So if you have the time and want to ask questions, I'm still here. You can stay a little longer.